Right. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Jesse Stife. I'm the president of the Reading League Florida. I'm really excited to be joined today by the wonderful Joan Sedita from Keys to Literacy for tonight's webinar, The Writing Rope and Integrating Reading and Writing. Just a couple of quick words before we get into it. I want to encourage everyone to keep up with your state chapter of the Reading League. You can find us here in Florida on Facebook and on Twitter. Or on our website at fl.thereadingleague.org. We're always sharing high quality resources that are directly applicable for teachers and other stakeholders. So please follow us on Facebook or other social media platforms if you're so inclined. While you're on our pages, I'll encourage everyone to make a donation. Your donations help keep us afloat here and to keep the high quality PD coming. We're an all volunteer 501c3 organization. And so this is only a labor of love that we all do for free in our spare time. And every penny goes right back into the organization. So we never want money to be a barrier to high quality PD. So we always aim to keep all of our resources free. For tonight's webinar, we've opened up the Q&A function and welcome our live participants to ask questions during the presentation. Joan will be taking some questions at the end. Please remember to use the Q&A just to ask questions and not to make general comments. And lastly, it's my honor to introduce Joan. Joan Sedita. She's an experienced educator with a long career and tons of experience, and has provided literacy professional development to thousands of educators over the years. Previous entries in her resume include experience as a teacher, administrator, reading first trainer, letters author and trainer, and many more. She's currently the CEO of Keys to Literacy, which is a nationally renowned professional development provider. And she continues to author important texts and consult with state departments of education and present nationally. So Joan, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jesse. And you know what, maybe what we could do is at the end, Jesse, if you don't mind taking a look at the Q&As and then pitching them at me, pick a few that are, are questions that you think most folks would like to hear. That would be very helpful. All right. Well, welcome everybody, and everybody who's going to be watching this in a recorded version. We're going to be talking about writing instruction. And I want to also make a connection as often as I can in this session to writing and reading, and why we should try to integrate them as much as possible. I'm going to be drawing from 3 books that I've written. The one on the right, The Writing Rope, just came out 2 years ago. And it's an overview of the Writing Rope framework, which I'll share with you tonight. The other 2 books are Keys to Early Writing, which is for kindergarten to grade 2 teachers, and Keys to Content Writing, grades 3 to 12. These are training books about more practical, how do you actually teach some of this stuff. So we'll do a combination of information from all 3 books. And hold on, there we go. So let's begin by having me give you an overview of the Writing Rope. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Scarborough's Reading Rope, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But this, I put this together back in 2018, basically because I felt that, well, most people in our field, the literacy field, and elementary teachers had a pretty good understanding that reading is made up of multiple components, right? So, beginning with the National Reading Panel back in 2000, they sort of set the model for this. But, if I were to say, what are the 5 components of reading? Most people can tell you it's phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary comprehension, right? Surrounded by oral language. But when it comes to writing, we've sort of neglected writing, right? We after the National Reading Panel and Reading First, we put a lot of energy into teaching reading, which is great. But I think whatever quality writing instruction might have been happening, a lot of that went by the wayside. And we really have not had the kind of intense focus on writing that I think we need to have. It's that tide is starting to turn. So, basically when I'm out there working with educators and I say, well, what do you think are the components of writing? If you had a curriculum for teaching writing, what should it include? It was very hard to get a concise answer. So basically borrowing from Hollis's framework, I decided to put the writing rope together. And as you can see, it's got 5 main strands, and each strand represents a category, if you will, of writing strategy, skills, and techniques. Again, if you were thinking about putting a curriculum together, or maybe you're an administrator and you're thinking about buying a writing program, which, by the way, I don't think we need programs that have scripted lessons, right, for teaching writing, because a lot of writing could just be integrated with what we're already teaching. But let's say you were. The idea here is that you want to make sure that what you're using to teach writing in your school or your grade is covering all of these areas. So I'll give a fast tour, and then what we'll do the rest of our time together is I'll take each strand, delve a little bit more deeply into it, and also make a connection to reading instruction. So if we start at the very bottom, we've got our transcription, and that's all about spelling and handwriting or keyboarding, literally skills that kids need in order to get the words on the page. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Writing craft. This includes a lot of things, especially things that tend to be tied to the English language arts teacher or a writing teacher, right? So it's various literary devices that we need to teach students, how to use maybe dialogue between characters in a story that a student's writing, or how to use figurative language, let's say. It also has to do with awareness of task, audience, and purpose. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Most writers, when you think about who you're writing for, especially if it's an authentic audience, and you're really focused on the purpose, it should help you make decisions about how you're going to write this piece, right? What words you're going to use. But oftentimes our students don't really think about that when they're writing. And then finally, word choice. This is all about vocabulary and the important role that making sure kids have enough words to use to express themselves. The third strand is text structure. And I actually tucked quite a few things in under here. If we start at the top level, it's the broader levels of text structure. These often are identified in many state literacy standards as the 3 types, including informational writing, opinion or argument as kids get in older grades, and narrative. So those 3 genres, and having kids understand the difference between them, and how do you write an introduction, and how is that different in an informational piece versus narrative, and how about conclusions, and what's the structure? Next is paragraph structure. And for those of you who work with older students, I'd like to emphasize that for many of our older kids in middle and high school, part of the reason they struggle with writing is they still are not able to write a quality sentence, and they don't know what a paragraph is. And when it comes to reading, that lack of understanding of what a paragraph is and that it's built around a main idea, that they're not able to take advantage of the clues that we get when we read, that when we switch from one paragraph to the next, it's like a sign in the road saying, hey, we're switching main ideas here. So paragraph structure is very important. Also in here are patterns of organization. So what's the difference between describing something versus giving a sequence or cause and effect, right? So there are various patterns of organization. And very much tied to these patterns are these things called transition words or phrases, sometimes called linking words. And these are things that help us make connections between our sentences and our paragraphs and our big chunks of text, but they also signal to the reader that this is going to be a description or this is going to be a cause and effect. So those are all the things under text structure. The next one up is syntax or sentences. And, sentences are really like the building blocks of all writing. And we can begin teaching good sentences and developing syntactic awareness with children as early as kindergarten. And again, many of our older students, their writing is impaired because they still cannot write a good quality sentence. So there are quite a few things that we can do to teach and develop students' ability to write more elaborated sentences, right? To use punctuation properly. But also it's about that syntactic awareness, understanding and growing the ability to know how the order of words in sentences need to follow basic grammar. And last but not least, and it only has 2 bullets under it, but there's an awful lot that come under this. And this is the critical thinking strand, right? So it's any writing skill or strategy that students need in order to write about what they're reading, using writing to learn, writing about the content they're learning. It's all the skills that they need if they're answering, a high stakes prompt on a writing test and, for the state or the district. So there's an awful lot of skills. Note taking is one of them. Summarizing is another one. But this is also where I put the stages of the writing process. We all know that quality writers follow stages. We don't just pick up the pen or start typing, right? We think before we write about what we want to say. Then we plan what we want to say using some kind of an organizational tool. Then we write, but then we also revise. And, the thinking, planning, and revising, students really should almost spend more time on that than they do on the writing. So that's the fastest tour of the writing rope. And as I said, I hope you'll use it as a way to take a look at what you're using to teach writing to make sure that everything is included. It also can be used as an assessment model. So if you're trying to determine students' strengths and weaknesses with their writing, if you have them do some writing samples and you start to analyze those samples with especially the first 4 strands in mind, it's going to be a nice guide for determining where the strengths and the weaknesses are. I've got a URL at the bottom of this slide that links you to one of the original first articles I wrote about this. So you can always learn more by going to that. It's in the free resources section at Keys to Literacy. One of the things before we start revisiting the strands that I also want to share with you is a model that Virginia Berninger and her colleagues developed, more than 20 years ago. They originally called it the simple view of writing and then started calling it the not so simple. Title doesn't really matter. What I want to highlight for you, though, is that the important role that executive functions play in being able to write, and why, when we have students who have weaknesses in executive functions, and think about our ADD or our ADHD students, right? When they have difficulties with executive function, it's going to make it harder for them to write. So in this model, you see up at the top text generation. So those are really all the things in the first 4 strands of the writing rope, right? How do you write? Spell words, write sentences, write text. Down on the bottom left, you have the transcription, spelling, handwriting. But over on the right, you've got the executive functions. And squarely in the middle is working memory, which is a big one of the executive functions. And so the writing rope, I think, is a good framework for thinking about what we need to teach students. But we want to be aware of kids who have difficulties in attention and goal setting and planning, right? And many of the scaffolds that we use to help students write, graphic organizers to plan before they write, right? Word lists of transition words, for example. These are all tools and scaffolds that we want to make sure we integrate into our instruction to help these kids that have executive function issues. All right, that said, I want to show you this little 2 puzzle pieces I put together, and you're going to see it repeatedly in my slides every time as a reminder to us that, hey, this is something that we can use both to teach writing, but also to teach reading, especially reading comprehension. So we'll keep showing this little visual. I also want to share a quote. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this. It's been around for a long time, but reading and writing float on a sea of talk. And, what does this mean? What does it mean to you? When you think about it, speaking and listening are natural things. Our brains have developed over however many years people have been on this earth, right? It comes naturally to us, but reading and writing do not. but they are built on the oral language, right? That we start learning when we're little infants. And so if we want to start talking about how can we connect reading and writing, I think the place to do so is to say that they both share the same cognitive processes. It's about language, right? But they also draw from the same well of oral language. It's the base. And when we think about it this way, that reading and writing are like two buckets drawing from the same well, I think it helps reinforce why it's so important for us to teach them together. Now, I mentioned a little bit earlier, Hollis Scarborough's reading rope. Hollis developed this over 20 years ago, organizing the skills and strategies needed for reading into two major chunks. And those of you who are familiar with the simple view of reading may recognize that these are also these two sides of the simple view. But basically, really quickly, if we look at the word recognition down at the bottom, it's about phonological awareness, which we need in order to spell. It's about decoding the alphabetical principle, which we need, learning spelling sound correspondences. We need that to decode words and to encode or spell them, right? Now, up at the top, we've got language comprehension related strands. Background knowledge. This is also concepts of print, right? Vocabulary, which we need for reading and writing. Language structures, and I want you to see the word syntax in there, right? Verbal reasoning, this is connected to the critical thinking strand of the writing rope. And then that literacy knowledge, which include genres like informational narrative and opinion. So I shared with you the writing rope. You briefly saw a review of the reading rope. What I've done here on this slide is make a connection for you. And so if you think about the background knowledge and verbal reasoning in the writing and the reading rope, it's aligned to the critical thinking skills and strategies. Language structures, syntax, we have a whole strand in the writing rope. Literacy knowledge about genres, that's that text structure. Vocabulary, that is important for reading, but also for writing. And then finally, the word recognition alphabetic principle, that's all related to transcription skills. So what we're going to do now is work our way through the rope. I'm going to say a little bit more about each strand and make a few more connections between reading and writing. So I mentioned earlier that transcription is literally the practical skills kids need to transcribe the words on the page, right? And we know that if handwriting and spelling are not fluent, and if they require a lot of effort, students can't focus on the higher level composing skills that they need beyond grade 3. And I want you to think about what you know about fluency for reading. When students don't have solid decoding skills, they have not developed an understanding of the alphabetic principle, and they're not automatic in their ability to decode those words, what does it do? It affects their ability to comprehend and make sense of what they're reading. So there's really kind of a yin and a yang here between the transcription skills for reading and spelling. Now, the transcription skills I've listed down on the left, and I often suggest that the best place to teach this is during phonics instruction, having students spell the words the same time that they're learning to read them. The composing skills on the right side are more the higher level thinking skills that have to do with writing, and it really represents the other 4 strands in the rope. So, as I mentioned, we want to make sure we're teaching letter sound correspondences. That's how are the sounds represented by the letters in the language, the graphemes. We also have to teach kids about syllable types and division and morphology, which is about meaningful word parts. And all of this will help students decode words as well as spell them. Now, learning to decode is usually a little easier than spelling, and that's because spelling is more difficult. As you know, in the English language, we have what's learned as a deep orthographic system, not transparent. In a transparent system, there's a sound and there's only one way to spell it. But in English, for example, the long sound of E, we have 8 ways to spell that sound. So it's a little bit harder to learn to spell, but kids need instruction in the same aspects of the alphabetic principle as they do for decoding. And one of the things you want to make sure you do is follow a phonics scope and sequence for decoding as well as spelling. And most high quality scope and sequences, right, begin with basic patterns, short vowels, blends, right, and work their way on up. Now, if you already have a core reading program that you're using that has a good phonics scope and sequence, you want to follow that. But sometimes programs that are used in schools don't have that. And so I have developed one. You can download it from the Keys to Literacy free resources section. There's a blog post devoted to this, and you can download a free phonics scope and sequence. All right, let's talk a little bit more about writing craft. And in particular, I want to focus on word choice, right? We need vocabulary to understand what we read. Researchers have determined that students need to have some familiarity with at least closer to 95% of the words in a text they're reading. Otherwise, it's going to affect their comprehension. But vocabulary is equally as important for writing. Think about how frustrating it is for a student to have something they want to say, they want to share, but they can't find the words to express it, right? They've got great ideas. So any instruction that we do for vocabulary, we want it to support writing as well. And as you teach words to students, have them use them in sentences, have them write, they'll learn them much better. We also talked a little bit about task, audience, and purpose, TAP. And as I mentioned, this is something that all good writers automatically think about. They don't even have to be conscious of it, right? But for many of our students, they don't. And so when we're teaching them to write, we want them to be highly aware of, why are you writing this? Who are you writing it to? Because it should make decisions about the words you use, sometimes even how long you make your writing piece. What are some other things that come under writing craft? Well, it's sometimes called writer's moves, or like the art of writing. And it's basically anything that a writer does to make your writing look or sound a certain way, right? So it's decisions you make about the tone that you want to come across with, your organization. And on this slide, I've identified even a few more. So writer's voice is a big one, right? It's the writer's unique style, right? Or emotion. It's sometimes called writing from the heart. And you use it through your choice of words, your language. I want you to think about, if you're about to read something, a story, and it starts with, "It was a dark and dreary night. The branches from the tree were scraping against the window." Now, aren't you already kind of feeling like this is going to be a scary story? So it's a very simple example of what we mean by writer's craft. And as I mentioned earlier, it's everything from using dialogue, figurative language, imagery, etc. Now, one of the things I want to do is also emphasize an instructional suggestion. And it's called sharing mentor models. So what do we mean by that? Well, one of the things we know just from our everyday experience, but research bears this out, right, is that part of the way we all learn to write is by emulating others. Okay, so if you have to write a reference for somebody, or maybe you're filling out a grant proposal, what's the first thing you do? You say, "Can I see how somebody else writes those?" Right? And this is true with students too. So we know that when we can show students example of mentor models of text, it's effective. Now, one of the problems is that some teachers, they just show like a big example of something, so they'll say, "Oh, look at this wonderful story that, this famous author wrote." Kids can't emulate that. What we want to do is be very specific. So if there's a particular move or technique or a structure, maybe you're trying to teach students how to write a topic sentence for a paragraph, or maybe how to state their claim in an argument, right? So what you do is you identify a few good choices of models that you use to demonstrate, and then you have the kids follow that. So what I thought I would do is show you some examples of how you can do this in the earliest grades and in the upper grades. What I'd like you to do is take a look. I've got 3 mentor texts here, and they all are sharing the same technique. What do you think the technique is that I want to focus on? And since I can't see you, I'm going to have to guess that some of you are saying, oh, it's speech bubbles, right? And each one of the examples, they did it in a slightly different way, right? So if I were using this with my students and I wanted them to, in their drawings, and with our young children, a lot of the way they express themselves and they compose is through drawings. So let's say we've had them do a drawing about some characters that they heard about in a read aloud, and we say we want them to talk to each other. So we would analyze these examples together. The teacher might even model one with the students, as a group, we create one. And then you might have the students work in pairs to add speech bubbles, right? And that's how you use a mentor model. So now what I'm going to do is show you an example from an upper grade. This one is from the Keys to Content Writing. So I'm sure you've all heard of a hook, right? Or a lead that writers use to kind of hook people in when they start reading, right? So there's lots of different kinds of leads, but there's 3 very common ones. One is called using a quote. Another one is you pose a question to the reader. And another one is to maybe start off with some interesting facts or details. So on this slide, I've got 2 examples of an introduction. They're both about high levels of dropout rates, right? One of them uses one of the leads, the other uses another. Now, if we were together, we'd read this out loud together. We're not. So I'm going to read out loud and you can follow along silently. Sarah White is an all too typical student in Philadelphia. She stopped going to school last year and was on her way to becoming one more dropout. The teachers didn't care. The students didn't care, White said. And I can't read it because my thing is in the way here, but hold on. Let me just move this little thing. All right, there we go. Nobody cared, so why should I? So let's go back. Which of the 3 techniques was used? Use a quote, right? Now, the next one, I'm not going to bother to read it out loud, but let your eyes just skim it over. And what do you notice? Awful lot of figures there, right? And so the lead or the technique used there was presenting fascinating facts. All right, so how would sharing mentor models like this, how would we use it with the students? Just like with the last example. We'd analyze it. We'd say, what technique did they use? We might then say to our students, all right, I want you to go back, take the introductions that you wrote to your compositions earlier this week, and I want you now to add a lead or a hook to it. And you can use any one of the 3 techniques. Now, what will happen is the students will go back and look at these as models, and that's what you want to have happen. So, a couple of big takeaways from the writing craft is the vocabulary supports writing and reading, right? But also the use of mentor models. Please take that away. It's a really valuable tool. All right, text structure. And let's talk about what that is. And you can see the 2 puzzle pieces, because when we teach text structure, and this last year I wrote a couple of blog posts devoted to why and how to teach text structure to support both reading and writing, right? When we teach this to kids, it does support their comprehension and their writing. So what is it? It's referring to how a piece of text is built. And that's literally what anybody who writes a text, a paragraph, a book, right? They are literally building something. And they do it by starting with sentences, and they move to paragraphs, they move to big pieces. It's like building the floor and the ceiling and making a room and then making a house. And that metaphor really helps kids. So what we want to do when we are teaching text structure, right, is to number 1, teach kids the differences among the 3 types of text. We want to teach them the structure of paragraphs, which is built on main ideas. We want to teach them about text features that provides clues to meaning, like headings and subheadings, right? A summary at the end of a chapter. Patterns of organization. How do you recognize that? And the transition words that go with it. So first, let's talk about the 3 types. It's helpful for kids to be able to readily recognize when something is a story or narrative, when something is opinion, they're trying to convince you of something, or whether it's just giving you information. And likewise, when our kids are going to write, they need to know that they have these three choices. And depending on what they want to say, which one is the best option. So, we begin by just sharing with kids these three types. You can create an anchor chart or a poster somewhere in your classroom so that students know the difference among these three types of writing. I've seen wonderful bulletin boards where the teacher will have narrative, informational, and opinion. And then as the students read books and get read alouds, listen to read alouds, they put pictures of the covers of the books under the three types of writing to constantly reinforce. And the important takeaway here is that we want them to not only know the difference among the three types, but to understand that they're organized differently when you write them. When you write a story, you're going to focus on setting and character, right? When you're writing information, it's going to be about topics and subtopics. And when you're writing an opinion, it's going to be about opinion components, like what's your claim, what's your reason, and what's your supporting evidence. I said a little bit earlier about paragraphs, but I truly believe that sentences and paragraphs are the building blocks. And if our kids can't get that right, the writing is never going to get much better. So we really want to make sure that in the early grades, kids can write quality paragraphs and sentences. And for many of our older kids, we might have to go back and provide some intervention instruction for that. But what is a paragraph? And when you think about it, we really don't talk in paragraphs. Paragraph is unique to text. And when we read text, you're going to see an indent or a double space every once in a while. And that's a clue. And that clue is telling you that, yeah, we're still learning about the same topic. Maybe we're reading about pirates, right? But this paragraph has got something different to say about pirates than the paragraph we just finished. It's changing the main idea. And for a lot of our kids, they fall apart because they don't get that concept of what a main idea is. That topics, when you write, paragraphs, when you write them, it's helpful to start with a topic sentence that tells your reader your main idea, and then you follow it with supporting sentences. So this has great implications for supporting both comprehension, having kids pause, reflect, what was the main point here after each paragraph, and then when they write, making sure that they chunk what they have to say into these meaningful units. And again, a lot of kids don't understand what a paragraph is. In the early grades, we teach them that it has three parts: the topic sentence, supporting details, and then a concluding sentence that sometimes kind of restates. But as kids get older, you want to remind them that when they're writing multi-paragraph pieces, while it is helpful to have a topic sentence for every paragraph, they don't necessarily have to write a concluding sentence for every single paragraph, right? They can put the concluding sentence at the end of their longer piece. So what are some activities we can do to develop paragraph skills? One is color coding. I'm going to show you an example of that. We can also have kids give them mentor samples of paragraphs and identify the topic sentence. We can give them a group of sentences for a paragraph and say one of them doesn't belong, doesn't fit the main idea. Which one is it? And then we can also give kids paragraphs that have a lot of supporting sentences, but the students have to create the topic sentence. And I just want to show you these examples of color coding because it's another way for me to emphasize how mentor models can be helpful. So I found this paragraph in a science textbook, and it just stood out to me because it was so perfectly structured. I want you to look at the first sentence. It tells you what the paragraph's about. The rest of the paragraph is several supporting sentences, and it actually has a nice conclusion. So when we use color coding, we first have students looking at well-written paragraphs to color code them. If it's got a topic sentence, make it green, supporting is yellow, and red for concluding. But eventually, you want to move to having students color coding their own paragraphs, right? to make sure that they're aware that they have, do I have my topic sentence? There it is. I'm going to highlight it in green, right? Do I have enough supporting sentences? And if they do include a conclusion, it's in red. So that's just one of several things that you can do. All right, let's delve a little bit more into patterns of organization. I started describing these. There are 5 major patterns, and you see them here. It can be really helpful sometimes for students to have this up as a, an anchor chart in the classroom. What are the 5 options that you can use when you write? A lot of times our students aren't sure what each of these means, so we have a little description. We can, when students are reading something, or if they're young and you're doing a read aloud, we can pause and use those mentor texts and say, hey, did the author use a description or a chronology? Hey, did the author do a compare and a contrast here, or were they showing you a cause and effect? And we look at those examples in the text we read, and then when the students are writing, we want to get them to use these patterns. Now, writing a description or an explanation is much easier than a cause and effect. So we also want to kind of have kids practice writing these in order, especially when they're in the younger grades. The other thing that we want to let students know as they start moving up in the grades is that when we read something, it might actually combine several patterns. So for example, if I'm reading an editorial, by the nature of it being an editorial, right? The editorial, let's say it's talking about a crime that was committed in the city. So it might start off with a description, right, of what happened. It might move into sequence, telling you the steps of what happened, right? But then it might end up, right, with an opinion or offering a solution to the problem of crime in the city. So we sometimes will read text that combines things, and our students, when they write, maybe one of their paragraphs is description, but then the next one might be a cause and effect. Now, when we teach text structure, patterns of organization, it is going to help students with their comprehension, because awareness of those patterns provides clues to making meaning. And it's also going to help their writing so that they can select the best option to present what they have to say. So you've got the 2 puzzle pieces once again. Transitions. Let's talk a little bit more about these. These words are they are so worth their weight in gold, right? And for many of our students, if you work with English language learners, they don't have many of these words. A lot of our students who enter school without sufficient exposure to oral language, they might not have transitions. And so we can explicitly teach students how to use these. What are they? They're used to link words, phrases, right? But they also clarify relationships, right? Compare and contrast. They show cohesion between things. Now, hold on a second. Why does this help reading? Well, again, when you're reading, if all of a sudden you see the word next, what does that tell you? Or if you see the word however or therefore, what does that tell you to help you make meaning? It's saying, I've said this or I've learned about this, but this is like the opposite. And so being aware of these transitions helps kids with their comprehension. But when students include them in their writing is going to be much more higher quality. On this slide, I've shared a couple of things with you. On the right, you see a list of transition words and phrases. This is a word I developed in 1978, and I have been distributing it ever since. In the 80s and early 90s, before we had the internet, I would sometimes have my old students send me a letter and asking me if I could send them another copy. Now with the internet, this is on the Keys to Literacy website. We get close to 30,000 visitors a month at our website. And one of the places they go to are all of these free resources, the transition list being one of them. Now, what I want you to notice here, and by the way, on that site, you can also download a simpler one for younger children. What I want you to notice is in the left column, we've indicated the purpose of the transition with a collection next to it on the right. So if you're trying to show a comparison, you can easily grab a transition from the right column. So I have found over the decades, literally, that this is really helpful for students to not just give them a list of transitions, but to give them that guide on the left side. So I strongly recommend that you grab either this one or create your own, make posters of them, make copies of them. If you use Google Classroom and you store electronic versions of scaffolds for kids, let one of them be the transitions. There's a little visual here of a poster. We sell posters. I'm not here to sell posters, but the point is, make these available. And what you'll notice is that when the kids are writing, that you'll watch them every once in a while look at the list, and it's because they're grabbing a word. So these words, as I said, are worth their weight in gold. All right, let's talk about the syntax strand. This is one of my favorites. Why does teaching kids about sentences? We know that it helps their writing, right? But what about reading? And what we're trying to do when we teach sentences is teach syntactic awareness, right? And I'll go over what that means in a minute. But it supports comprehension when kids encounter long, complex sentences. They can unpack them and make meaning out of them. And then it supports writing in helping kids write longer, more elaborated, high-quality sentences. So what is syntax? It means the system and arrangement of words, phrases, and clauses that make up a sentence. It's basically understanding the grammar of your first language, right? So one by one, sentences, whether we speak them or whether we do this in writing, and a lot of what you can do to teach sentence sense, right, can be done orally with kindergartners and first graders, even if they can't write sentences. But if you think about it, one by one, that's how we build a text. There are ideas, they're called propositions that are in a sentence. The boy pulled the red wagon. How many propositions? We've got a boy, we've got a wagon, he's pulling it, and it's red. There's a lot of ideas in there, right? The longer our sentences get, the more propositions are in them. And so when we do activities that develop that sense of sentences, it helps kids, like I said, unpack the longer sentences and also write better sentences. This slide also kind of emphasizes that, right? That it's little sentences combined together to make big ones. And I don't know how many of you have ever heard of sentence combining, but this is a highly researched strategy, an activity. Back in 79, 80, when I was getting my master's degree from Harvard, I did one of my thesis papers. We always knew that it helped writing, but we didn't know if it helped reading comprehension. And even back then, we had research showing that. So this has been around for a long time. And we know that sentence combining helps kindergartners and all the way up through college students. Now, sentence combining is one of 4 activities that I can suggest for developing syntactic awareness. We don't have much time for me to go through all of them. So I'm going to, in a minute, show you a little bit more about sentence combining. It's why I have the star there. But things like sentence scrambles, sentence elaboration, activities for teaching kids the difference between a fragment and a complete sentence. If you would like to learn, some more of those, I think I mentioned before, every month since 2015, so it's been 9 years now, I write a blog and I pick a topic and I explore it and I give suggestions and references to research. There is a 2-part blog that I wrote explaining each one of these. So if you really want some details about how to do each of these, you can grab the blogs. So let's explore sentence combining a little bit more. As I mentioned, been around, well-researched across all grades. What's really fascinating is that it's been found to be even more effective than what some researchers call traditional grammar, right? That is things like labeling parts of speech, right? Or correcting students' grammar. I think the reason it's so powerful is that, as you'll see in a moment, it forces students to play with the words, to manipulate the words, and put them into different orders, say them out loud, and see if it sounds right, to their grammar ear. So it's very, very well researched. Now, let me give you some examples. I'd like you to combine these two into one sentence. The book was good, the movie was good. And again, I can't hear you, so I'm going to assume you came up with something like this, right? Maybe you said the movie and the book were good, or maybe the book and the movie were both good. Any of those are good. All right, how about these two? The thirsty girl drank lemonade. Or how about these two? So there are lots of ways we could do this, but the idea with sentence combining, and you always start, especially with young ones, with two very simple short sentences, right? And the idea is they have to combine it into one sentence that they can add some words, subtract some words, but all the important propositions have to be there. Now, I'm going to show you how difficult you can make this on the other end of the scale. So this is from a science classroom that we've done some training in, right? They were learning about wildlands, and the teacher constructed these 7 short sentences, and the students had to put them together into one big sentence. Now, if we had time, I'd ask you to do it, and I bet within 3 minutes you'd be able to do this. The idea here is that whether you're doing something simple like this or more challenging like this, and by the way, you would never hit kids with something this challenging right off the bat, right? But there's this continuum that when kids do this, and you want them to do it frequently in short spurts of time. So if I twice a week, as kids were coming in the classroom, put up 2 or 3 sentences for them to combine into one, they'd build that practice, and that's what really makes a difference. So that's sentence combining. All right, we have time for our last strand, the critical thinking. And why is this important? Well, and I'm just going to jump to this slide here. There was a very interesting report that came out, a research report. Graham, and I think it was Hebert, they took a look at all the research about how writing might support reading. And the guide that came out was called Writing to Read. You can Google it and access it very easily. Not surprisingly, turns out writing supports reading in lots of ways. The one I want to focus on is their first recommendation out of that. And that is that when we have students write about what they are reading, it improves their comprehension. And what are the things we want them to write? Personal reactions to the text, write summaries, write notes, and write answers, as well as creating questions in writing. So when we do this, it supports comprehension, but when they write about what they're reading, it also strengthens their writing ability. And so I want you to think about why. Writing is thinking. How many of you write a grocery list before you go to the food store? Okay, I do. Some of us just write a random list. Some of us get really compulsive and we put all the frozen food together and all the fruits and vegetables together, right? But the point is, what happens if you forget your list at home? Does the fact that you wrote it help you remember what you need to buy? And that's the point I'm trying to make here. When we write, it forces us to organize and clarify our ideas, right? It extends our thinking. We have to engage with the information. And when we write about text, even little quick writes, quick little exit ticket out the door, when we have students write, it really pushes them to be able to think more deeply. The problem is when we ask kids to write from text, there's an awful lot of skills they need to have. And if you think about it, there's a first set of skills. They need to have proficient comprehension skills. If they don't understand what they just read or the video they just watched, it's going to be really hard to write about it. So there's a bunch of comprehension strategies we want to teach them. But let's say they did understand and now they want to write about it. Well, if they don't have proficient skills in all those strands in the writing rope, they're not going to be able to show you that they understood it. So when we give students, prompts where we ask them to write about something using a source, we want to analyze if they aren't able to do it. Is the problem with the comprehension or is it with the writing skills? And what are some of the skills we need to teach kids? Well, if they're reading a text that's on paper, we want to show them how to annotate, how to highlight, how to write margin notes, how to circle things, right? We have to teach them how to take notes. That was one of the things in that report, right? Teaching kids a note-taking strategy. And any of you who are familiar with my work, you know that 2-column is something I'm a big fan of. We have to teach them how to plan before they write, how to use graphic organizers to organize what they have to say. Then we have to teach them all those skills in the writing rope, right? That have to do with writing good sentences, organized paragraphs. We have to teach them text structure. How do you write topic sentences? How do you write introductions, conclusions, and how do you use transitions? And then finally, we have to teach them how to revise and edit. A lot of our students don't know how to do that. So this last critical thinking strand in the rope has got an awful lot to it. I also mentioned that I put in under this strand the stages of the writing process. And, they've been studied for a long time. Back in the 60s, 70s, these researchers started looking at what do good quality writers do? And maybe if we could figure that out, we can teach our students how to follow that. And what they discovered was that good writers follow these stages, right? They've been identified a long time. Back about 10 years ago, my colleagues and I at Keys to Literacy, we decided to come up with a quick little acronym to help kids remember the stages. So it's called the process writing routine. You can see it right here. The first letter of each word stands for think, plan, write, and revise, right? Make sure kids don't skip any of these steps. Now, you might ask, why is there an arrow? Well, the arrow is there to remind kids that while we do want to go in that order, right? Eventually, we may go back and revisit our stages. It's a recursive process. So when you get to the writing stage and you realize that, I need some more information, you might have to go back to the think stage to get more information. Or when you revise, you may realize, gee, this is kind of disorganized. Maybe I better go back to my planning stage, maybe redo my outline or my graphic organizer and reorganize it. So that's the point. It's recursive. All right, we have about 7 minutes left. So there's a couple things I want to leave you with. And then Jesse, if there's any questions, you can pose them. First of all, I just want to highlight a couple of key takeaways from this, right? I want you to think about the writing rope and remember always that writing instruction has to address all the components. It's not enough to just teach paragraphs or teach spelling or handwriting. All teachers can play a role, right? So many of these things, especially writing about what you're reading and learning, text structure, this can happen in any subject. We want to be explicit with our instruction, right? And I, we, you. And that's what mentor models do, right? It allows us to model for kids, guided practice, and then they do it on their own. And we want to make sure we don't avoid assumptions. The older our students get who have difficulty with writing, the more we assume they have the basics, like how to spell, like how to write a good sentence, and we don't want to make those assumptions. All right, so the next thing I'm going to share with you is this is a URL, and you can either take a screenshot with your camera or use the tiny URL. Keys to Literacy is running a raffle. We have a series of 3, right, Jesse? This is mine is the kickoff. And so Keys is going to raffle off your choice of, you can pick any one of the Keys to Literacy online courses and book, and you'll get it for free. So those of you that are on tonight, do this soon because they're going to do it on October 3rd. If you are watching this in the recording and you're watching it before October 3rd, join in. If you're watching it after October 3rd, it's probably too late. So I'll leave that up for a minute or two, and then I will also close out with a slide that has the links to those free resources. So while we're looking at this, Jesse, do you have any questions for me?
Yeah, thank you so much. So there were a couple of questions that we got from some of our members prior to the webinar. We have a particularly plugged in group of folks who follow us. One question that I think was very good and relevant here was from a third grade teacher who is kind of dipped their toe into writing instruction with the writing revolution and was taken with the because, but, so exercises. And for those folks who aren't, familiar, you start with a sentence stem. The queen sat at the court because, and then,
Yep.
or you said but, and then so. So it's a sentence elaboration exercise. And you know, they were wondering about the balance in time between explicit skill instruction like that versus using those strategies to kind of to create and revise students' ongoing writing, whether that changes over time, how much instruction might be too little or too much.
Yeah.
Just kind of talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say there's some excellent suggestions in that book. I've known Judith Hochman a long time. We both espouse an explicit approach to teaching writing. I also want to make a connection to that, to a couple things I said in this session tonight, right? The first is I want you to think about the sentence combining, right? We did not have time to really explore sentence combining in depth, but one of the things that you want to teach students when they're doing sentence combining is those connecting words, right? Which, because, so, and, but, right? There's several of them. That's part of the instruction for sentence combining. And some of our students need that scaffold where, how I showed you the two sentences? I might down below actually give you the word because or and or as a scaffold. So that can definitely be woven into sentence combining. The other thing is that a couple of those words, like because, is a transition word, right? That connects a cause and effect, right? So there's lots of ways that those little words can work. To the question about how much time and energy you spent maybe teaching it up front versus then just referencing it in revision. I think it happens in both places, right? It also depends on the students you have in front of you, where you are in the school year, and whether this thing has been taught the previous year to students, right? So, one of the things that we say in our training for both the early writing and the content writing is that a lot of the work you do around sentences and sentence combining ends up being a tool you use at the revision time. Because if students have practice combining sentences and moving and playing with words, and also some other techniques we have, using the W words to extend your sentence, like where, when, how. These are all things that when students have written something and now it's at the revision, if you can say to them, all right, right now we want you to focus your revision just on your sentences. Do you see any really short sentences that you could combine? Right? Or I see a really short sentence here. It's got only one piece of information. If you added where and when, would that expand your sentence? So I think whether they're strategies you're pulling from, Judith's book or my books or the writing rope, um, you have to explicitly teach them at some point, but then once the students are closer to that you do it stage in the IWU, now they've got to start applying it as they do their writing and they revise. I hope that helps. And that's not just for third grade. That's for anything we've been talking about tonight.
Absolutely. Like with all worthy educational questions, the answer is it depends. Depends on the student, depends on the time, depends on the
Yeah. One or two more questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, so there was another, I guess, similar kind of question about text structure instruction. Um, text structure instruction, obviously an unassailable research-based practice, similar to text structure instruction in reading comprehension. But as I'm sure you're aware, there's a lot of questions around when the extent to which we're using that instruction as a means to access, authentic text and to create students' own pieces of writing versus versus as an end to themselves, right? I think about the article, no more strategy instruction of the week that came out a couple of years ago, or that the kind of the overemphasis on skill instruction.
Yeah,
Um,
well, gosh, I could spend a day on this topic, but I've spent a lot of my career working, especially my first 23 years out of my 48 years, working with kids that had dyslexia and learning issues. So, struggling readers and writers. It's hard to be good at something if you don't have the basic skills, right? And so, yes, ultimately we want writing to be creative. We want kids to learn and to love to express themselves through their writing. But if they don't have the rudimentary skills to do that, it's kind of hard. So, obviously, given my experience, I'm going to lean pretty heavy on. And by the way, kids don't magically figure these out, right? You have to do the kinds of activities, and research bears that out. If you look at Steve Graham and his colleagues, he's been a leading researcher in this. And one of their big recommendations is any strategy that a student needs for any stage of the writing process, right? They need explicit instruction and guided practice. Okay. So that said, no, it certainly is not it's just the means to the end to be able to accomplish that. And that's why we also have to share mentor texts with kids that not only highlight a particular strategy or a skill, like here's how you use a transition word, right? But why we also want to share mentor texts that get kids motivated to want to write, that they enjoy reading and it can light a flame for them as well. So I think you need both. And unfortunately, if you look at the writing and reading skills of our students across the United States right now, we are in dire straits. And, it's like I like to do watercolors, but it would have been really hard for me to create a nice watercolor if nobody had showed me how to mix the paints and how to draw in perspective. So, yeah. All right. I know we're over, but let's do one more. Go ahead.
let's see. So there was one other question around executive functioning difficulties.
Mhm.
You kind of touched on it with talking about graphic organizers and helping kids, particularly kids with ADHD or kids who are experiencing trauma, who may have executive difficulties, kind of help plan and organize. Are there other strategies, other approaches for things like goal setting or self-talk that you're aware of, or resources that you like to point folks to?
Yeah, again, Stephen Graham and his wife Karen Harris, who've been researching writing forever, part of a set of strategies that they've been developing for 30 years now, SRSD, part of that is self-regulation, right? That's a big part of it. And they've really investigated the role that these executive functions play. And so, things like self-talk, that kids, things they can say to themselves to stay on task, those are really helpful. But for the most part, I'm going to fall back on those scaffolds that we use. When a student is disorganized, their writing is going to come out. It's just going to fall out, right? But if and we don't just say use a graphic organizer, we literally give them one, we model it, we walk them through it step by step, right? When we use those kinds of scaffolds, now they've got something to keep them on task. And then, things like, especially older kids, they get tripped up with this. When we give them an assignment, a lengthy writing assignment, and it's due in 3 weeks, and we don't like check in, we've got to give them calendars, we've got to hold them accountable. Some of that falls in under study skills. So yeah, we just have to be aware of how hard it is for somebody who can't stay focused to do writing. It's hard to do reading, but I think it's even harder with writing. So I think I'd say if you're looking for more, look up Steve Graham, Karen Harris, just Google their names, self-regulation. Great ideas there.
Yeah, absolutely. I count my training in SRSD as some of the most valuable I've ever taken. It's one of those things I just wish it were in every school across the country. And it's just, yeah, you're right. It's been around for so long, just super evidence-based. I'm currently reading Powerful Writing
Yeah,
Strategies for All Students.
yeah, and
Uh,
that book has been out for a while. It's been out for a while. So yeah.
fantastic.
All right, Jesse, thank you so much. Thank you everybody for tuning in. And I hope you take advantage of some of the, the blog posts and the free resources.
Thank you, Joan, and we appreciate it. And thank you, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.